I'm delighted to be here. The topic that Nikunj suggested is to speak about Hindu contributions to the world. Parth's father, a dear friend of mine, was the first person who invited me to speak on this subject back in the 90s. In New Jersey state, the state government, they were celebrating some festivals, so this was Diwali. So I decided I'll speak on, Indian contributions, Hindu contributions. And since then I've developed it and I'm turning this into a book actually. When I went to school board meet, New Jersey Governor McGreevey in those days created a Asian American Commission. I was a commissioner and in charge of Asian studies curriculum in the schools. That was my hot topic, the reason to be a commissioner. I wanted to impact the school system. So they made me a commissioner, and my job was to revise the curriculum and how they taught India, Hinduism, and so on. So they opened up lots of teachers and various committees for me to go and talk to. And these were supposedly their experts on education. So I started one of the meetings, and this idea I got talking to Parth's father, Devendra Singh, who's a good friend of mine. I started by talking to these teachers on Indian contributions that ought to be taught as part of American history. So I started by asking them a question: why? Okay, you want me to create a section for that, but why is India relevant in American history? Not a single one of those teachers could give me any answer. And they had no, this is before the Y2K bug and the year 2000 when IT became big from India. Otherwise today they would have said, oh, because I have a friend who's an IT guy or something, or because there's a guy in a call center. They might have given that kind of reason today, but they had no reason. They couldn't understand why it's relevant. So I started by asking them, why did Columbus come to this place? What was he looking for? And they hadn't thought. And actually, the Queen of Spain was like a venture capitalist, was looking for new intellectual property, and secret routes to get to a certain place were very well protected, because if you knew how to get to a place and back, others didn't. You had trade advantage. You could bring trade goods and sell them, and you would have a market to yourself because nobody else knows how to get those goods. So India and China had traditionally been very big sources of goods for Europe. But the Ottoman Empire, you've heard of the Crusades, right? The Ottoman Empire was a Muslim empire from Turkey, and they had expanded, taken over much of Central Europe, Eastern Europe, and they controlled, the Christians were down, and these guys controlled the land routes to India and China. So the goods would not reach Europe except through their enemy, the Muslims, and they could either block the goods or they could charge them 20 times or whatever. So your enemy controlled the supply of many important things. That was Europe's situation. So there was a huge demand to find sea routes. And that's why Vasco da Gama went one way around Africa and reached India. And Columbus was sent the other way across the Pacific because they did not know America exists, and they thought if you go across the Pacific, you will reach India. And that's how the story of America begins. Now, if it hadn't been India, but some white country, they would start like that. They would say the very opening page on how America was, started by Columbus. I mean, it was not really a discovery because the natives had already discovered it. The Native Americans had lived here for 20,000 years. But it was a discovery for Europeans. And that story is from India. It starts with an Indian. So that would tell us, why was India so important? Why was trade with India so sought after? Why were they doing these wild things, explorations to find a route around the Ottoman land blockade? So this takes you into what were the contributions of India which made it so important as a destination. And this is a huge topic. So I positioned it like that. And then I talked about more recently, in American history, early 1800s, a whole movement started with a man called Emerson, which became known as the Transcendentalist movement. And one of his followers was Walt Whitman, very famous man, poet, one of the greatest poets of this country, and then Thoreau, and then T.S. Eliot, who was a Harvard professor. Now these people are taught, studied as great poets by generations of Americans, but actually their immersion in Hinduism is not well appreciated. Emerson, who started this whole transcendentalist thing, in those days they were not, Sanskrit was not being studied or taught in the US, it came later. It was in Europe, of course. So his knowledge was of Upanishads and Gita and all that was indirect through English translations by Europeans. He was so profoundly impressed. He wrote about Brahman, he wrote about karma, he wrote about reincarnation. He was so impressed. And he was one of the prominent intellectuals of his time. He officially resigned from his church because he says, I no longer can be a member of this church because he completely rejected the Christian ideas. Harvard, and he was a well-known speaker at Harvard. When he went to Harvard for a famous speech, in that speech he says that he's no longer Christian and he's completely shifted his ideology. Harvard passed a resolution, Harvard passed a policy that Emerson will not be allowed back on campus. So much for intellectual freedom. Okay? This is facts, by the way, you can look up. And then some years ago, I think maybe a decade, I don't know, some years back, Harvard, because he was a great Harvard guy, a Harvard, man from Harvard, one of Harvard's famous products. Ignoring this blockade on him, fatwa on him from Harvard, they were going to celebrate his centenary of some kind, his birth, death, or some big anniversary of Emerson was coming up. And Harvard spent 2 years celebrating it. They put up a website and all kind of events were going to happen. They never mentioned a single word either about how he rejected Christianity because of his knowledge of Hinduism, or about how Harvard, as a result of that, put a fatwa against his coming back to the campus. So imagine the doctoring of the history of Emerson. Now, from Emerson's point of view, this was a turning point. It's such a huge thing for him to have woken up and rejected his old ideology and espoused a new ideology. This would be a leading story if you're talking about the life of a man. You would say this is a very big part of his life. To keep silence on it and then to be celebrating his anniversary is kind of a big hypocrisy. So I wrote to them. I wrote to Harvard. There was no Facebook Live and no Twitter. I couldn't make a big impact, but I wrote enough, made enough nuisance. And then they put in a little bit on the website about, once upon a time he made some controversial speech at Harvard, like that, kind of undermining it. So if you address Americans, they know these names. You should do your research and know how to talk about the history of American literature and the intellectual history of America from the 1800s onwards. You will see a huge amount of influence on Emerson, Whitman, Thoreau. And then in the early 20th century, T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot, some of his famous poems are translations of Upanishads. He was a Sanskrit scholar. He at one time wrote that comparing the books of India, the Vedic texts of India, with the entire the great works of the West, it makes the Westerners look like schoolboys. That is one of his quotes, which they don't talk about. But a scholar called Cleo Kearns went to Cambridge, and she actually, in England somewhere, she did her doctorate on T.S. Eliot and how the Indian traditions influenced him. And she wrote a book called T.S. Eliot and Indic Traditions. and my foundation got the rights to reprint it in India and let the Indian left wing and all these English honors people in JNU understand that what they are talking is actually Hinduism reformulated. And to do her doctorate, she went and lived with T.S. Eliot's widow, who was alive at the time. And she let this person see T.S. Eliot's private diaries, which had never been seen before. T.S. Eliot had a collection of major Sanskrit books. He was a Sanskrit scholar. And in the margin of the Sanskrit books, he is giving little synopsis in English, as you go. Sometimes, how you write on the notes. And some of those translations of Vedic texts, Upanishadic texts, are the big punchlines in his famous poems. The Wasteland, the Four Quartets. If you look at some of the famous poems of T.S. Eliot, you'll be surprised philosophically they sound very, Vedic, kind of, Vedantic. But there is a reason for it. So if you go and do investigative research of this kind, you'll find an amazing amount of Indian contributions to Western thought. So we have the transcendentalists in the 1900s, in the 19th century. Then there is a theosophy movement. Then there is a new thought movement. Now all these are different names for movements, but they're basically taking a lot of Indian ideas and reformulating them for various audiences. So while the transcendentalists were totally intellectual, philosophical, abstract thinkers about metaphysics, the theosophists were into esoteric practices, tantra practices, yogic practices, both Hindu, Buddhist kind of things. And they were mixed up. They were trying to figure out how to digest it into ancient Roman and Greek gods and goddesses. They were trying to also see if they can reconcile it with Christianity and borrow these ideas. They were anti-Christian. They were also bringing new interpretations to revive Christianity. They were kind of muddled up people. But sometimes these incubators, intellectual incubators, where ideas are being churned, have a huge influence to the next generation. Because as a byproduct, they come up with speculations and these things catch on. So from the transcendentalists to the theosophists, then there was a new thought, the movement called the New Thought movement, which means that this is the new thing, So this also is filled with many Americans highly influenced by Indian thought. So then comes Swami Vivekananda, and his influence is huge. He influenced some Nobel Prize winners in literature. His followers, Vivekananda's influence was so huge that it deserves like a whole volume. So in my incomplete books, I have on all these topics separate books that I'm hoping to finish. But it's each time I try to finish one, there's so much more material that it expands, So, but the whole Vivekananda's influence, the influence on the Vedic heritage in American 19th century, these are big untold stories. We have to put that into the American curriculum because they can't deny that since they're teaching these things, we're just asking that you have to now correct what you're teaching. You have to include the Indian influences in all these things. So if you look at gurus coming, until Vivekananda came, the influence was indirect through Europe. They would read European accounts, people like Emerson and so on, and that was the influence. But with Vivekananda coming, the first sort of big guru, super guru coming and making a direct impact. And then Paramahansa Yogananda brings a lot. Then J. Krishnamurti brings a lot, and so on. So the history of major gurus then becomes the milestones of major chapters in this American, the Hinduization, if you will, of the American intellect. This is a very big story. If you look at the history of yoga in America, in the early 1900s, 100 years ago from now, 110 years ago, there were people, Americans, who had come back and brought yoga, and there's books on them. And it's very, some of them are quacks, some of them are solidly loyal to the tradition, some of them are Christians, some of them are anti, like the various factions today. This is happening at that time also. So the yoga movement starts more than 100 years ago in this country, but it's very low key, very few kind of people know it. And it's really in the 60s that it begins to grow in a very big way. That's when large number of Indian gurus come. It's not Americans bringing it back here, but Indian gurus come here and the floodgates open. That's when the thing becomes very big. You know, you look at J. Krishnamurti's influence. J. Krishnamurti's, one of his big influences was this Rudolf Steiner. Rudolf Steiner is a towering figure. He started out as a theosophist. He wanted to be the head of the theosophy movement, but when Annie Besant made J. Krishnamurti, the young boy, the movement leader, this fellow Rudolf Steiner quit and started his own separate movement. It's called anthropomorphism. Anthropomorphism is a complicated name, but that's his idea of all this. And he's teaching reincarnation, and he's teaching karma, and he's teaching all these kind of things, reformulated, trying to include it into Christianity, having a problem with the church doing it, having these fights, not wanting to call it Hindu because they'd kicked him out, they didn't like it. Christians won't accept it, but negotiating that. And the Waldorf schools, there's a whole chain of Waldorf schools in the United States. Maybe there's some here also. They're very well-known private schools. They are part of his organization started it. And you know, a friend of mine in India, learned guy, intelligent guy, good Hindu, calls me and says he's joined this anthropomorphism. It is the greatest thing. It is not a religion. It is a spirituality. It takes the best of East and West, and it is invented by these American people. So I know all about it. So I tell him that, look, I'll tell you. It started by Rudolf Steiner. He was surprised that I even know that. And I said Rudolf Steiner was a colleague of J. Krishnamurti. J. Krishnamurti got the job. He got kicked out, and he took all that and turned it into his own thing. But none of this it is already packaged. So you better study the original Shastras. You don't need all this, hodgepodge, reformulated khichdi. And he didn't like it. But his wife kind of got the point. She looked at it, and later on, a year or so later, she said, yeah, you're right. But anthropomorphism is rave in India now, among the very elite, intellectual, modern, upscale Indians who want this nice, jazzy, new thing, new kind of a thing coming in. So what I'm trying to tell you is that there is a large number, volumes and volumes can be and should be written on these sort of intermediaries. Major schools in this country, major schools of thought, major intellectual figures as individuals have played this role of taking stuff from India, disassembling it into parts, reassembling it into Christianity or into something original of their own. And I could go on. And today it's one of the books I'm working on is this whole New Age movement from the 60s on, how it took a whole lot of Indian stuff, Hindu stuff, and reformulated it for American consumption. So this is a kind of project, it's not for one guy. You need a whole lot of people doing all this. And where are my helpers? I don't find them, So this is the kind of research on which I could go on telling you. My time is just half an hour, but I could go on telling you for days. I could give you seminars on a whole lot of stuff on the Indian contributions to the making of America. It is not just made of some Englishmen who came and this and that. There's many imports from various cultures, including Indian culture, in the making of the United States. So before we talk about, the contribution of India to today's era, new thing coming like yoga, actually these are very old history of all these things. Now, today, one of the cutting edge contributions is in mind sciences. These are in the 1800s it was literature, philosophy, that kind of a thought. Then in the early 1900s it was esoteric practices, experimental stuff. Then in the 60s was yoga, meditation. Now it's gone into neuroscience, cognitive science, that type of thing. Nobel Prizes to be given in these areas because you see who are at the cutting edge. There is also Ancestry.com kind of thing. How many of you, show a hand, have heard of Ancestry.com, where you send them some saliva or any DNA sample, and they'll tell you your DNA, and they'll tell you X% of you came from this country, from that country, this one, that one. That's your profile. And doctors can also look at your DNA, and they can tell you have predisposed for this disease, that disease, so much probability, so much happening in your family. So what science is acknowledging now through DNA is a sophisticated version of what in the 1800s was called race science. It was called race science. That was the name for it. It was a thriving academic discipline, the study of races in a scientific way, and they were measuring noses and whatnot. They were measuring these external phenotypes and body, skin color, this and that, and profiling races and coming up with who's more intelligent, less intelligent, trying to find correlates and come up with the behavioral characteristics of races. And then all that led to blatant racism and discrimination and stuff like that. And so in the 20th century, this was outlawed, and this was considered like not a good thing to do. So, but now, without calling it race science, something similar, more dangerous potentially is happening, where one day employers may say, we want your DNA profile, because it will tell us whether you're good in math or not, whether you have anger problem, whether you have a propensity for opiate addiction, whether insurance company might say, this will tell us what is your risk profile, because if you may be safer, you may not as safe, your insurance rates may be accordingly, it could happen. And so like people put all these matrimonial ads, and they say, this is my profile, but maybe the spouse will ask for, in these matrimonial.com, they'll ask for your DNA profile, and you'll have to give your DNA ID number, where this particular medical group has your DNA profile. It can only be released with your consent, but I want to have it as part of what I'm doing. So is this kind of a upgraded, much more dangerous also, scientific benefits because maybe they can cure you, but also much more dangerous than race was, because now you will say it's all science. I'm not biased against you for your race, but it says this in your DNA. And so while that could that creates some interesting controversial discussions, it also opens up whether the idea of varna was something similar, and this idea of that you don't marry internally and all that, a whole lot of these things were respected in our tradition, and the structure of a jati, they have a certain skill set, and they are specializing in something, and they transmit it down family, father to son and all that. It goes to the next generation a certain way. All of this is being dismantled since the European Enlightenment movement, which says that all this is bad and what we need is egalitarianism. So under egalitarianism, there aren't any differences between one person and another. Everybody is taught the same amount spent on teaching them math, teaching them baseball, and so on. Under this new system, maybe a better allocation, a more optimum allocation of social resources is that this guy should be taught more math. He has a propensity, he's likely to use it, and this guy should be taught more visual art and skills like that, because that's what the profile says. I think this is a very hot topic, a very controversial topic, a very risky topic, but we need to do this sort of research. So the relevance of Indian contributions is not only past, it's not only present, but there's also a lot of futuristic things. You look at other futuristic ideas like how, United States is going to have older and older people. By the time you guys are old, you live to be 100. The life insurance companies expect that the present young generation who are in their 20s, their expectancies is way up to in the 90s. So while people will live longer, what happens to the psychological state of mind? Are they happier? Are they able to, or is it that they're geriatrics, they'll be under drugs and they'll be zombies? Right now, the extension of the lifespan has created problems, because after a certain age, people are senile, they don't have mental capacity, families are broken down, there's nobody to look after them. So are Indian methods of joint family going to come, that kind of a thing going to come back? Are the mind management methods of meditation going to become more prominent to manage mental health of people? These are important contributions. So I don't feel that India has done its full, whatever was to be harvested from India has been already harvested, and that's the end of the day. I think that reviving the Indian paradigms and the Indian ways of thinking scientifically is fertile ground for future research. Now, there is a friend of mine who lives in Boston, Balram Singh. He was supposed to be, but I'll see him later tonight. He's a chemistry professor, and he has found that Ayurvedic concoctions, which have heavy metals like gold and silver, are banned in United States. You can't make, because it's bad for your health. You know, gold and silver will create all kind of serious problems for you. He has found that when you incorporate such metals at the tiniest size as nanoparticles, then not only is it not harmful, but actually it creates some benefits. So these nanoparticles with some heavy metals in them don't flow through vessels, but they can penetrate into the vessel walls. So if blood is flowing, then some of these things can get out of the blood, out of the vessel into other parts of the body. So this cure can happen, and then it gets back into the digestive tract. So he's doing this research on Ayurvedic concoctions, the biochemistry of them, and the biochemistry of ghee. And he's writing papers, and I'm very happy that he's using the Ayurvedic terms. He's not calling it some Balram Singhism type new concoction, new vocabulary. I told him, I said, you should stick to it. And you should have in the appendix a reference to where it comes from. And he's doing that. So, cutting edge research in medicine, in mental health, in social, family kind of stuff can happen with the benefit of Indian thought being brought back. And what about political, social things like Arthashastra being taught? Because there's economic models that are innovative. So we have become a very reductionist, westernized, over-westernized world culture, assuming that the foundations and framework that the West developed in the 1700s and 1800s is the panacea and the be-all and end-all for the whole world. It's being challenged by two civilizations successfully, China and Islam. Neither China wants to accept the supremacy of Western thought. They do not accept Western universalism. They have their own Chinese universalism based on their own, Confucian and all that kind of stuff. And they're doing so much research on it. I know an acupuncturist, and he says that when you look at these meridian lines and this chi, which is similar to like pran, and how it flows, this is heavy research in China. The government funds it. They're getting patents on it. And he says that when I said, but none of the Western anatomy books will recognize that such thing exists. He says, we are happy they don't recognize because we control it, we keep developing it. Our solutions are important. And rather than them appropriating and plagiarizing, we are making it our own. This is made in China thing for the whole world. We will be selling the next generation of medical treatment. We'll be sending up our doctors in hospitals all over the world, and we will take over that large part of the healthcare market. What a sensible thing to do. Our government needs to do that with Ayurveda on a much bigger scale than we have. It's not about heritage for nostalgia and ego and chauvinism and all that. It's really practical, these kind of things. The other challenge is coming from Islam, which I think will fail, because the Islamic challenge to the West is of a fanatical kind and not a logical kind. It is not universalizable. They won't have too many people who want to go to Islamabad for college studies and all that. I don't think they'll be able to attract the youth, that they are the cool culture or the culture with solutions. So while the West is being attacked both from the Chinese side and the Islamic side, I think the Chinese are doing a much better job, and they do have a good civilizational alternative. So in this three civilizational contest between the West and this Islam and China for mind share, where is India? Where does India fit in? And India has a good story and a good case, but we just haven't, we do not have a Ministry of Civilizational Studies kind of thing. That kind of a thing we don't have. They're all little silos. HRD is they are doing good work. I mean, they're certainly changing things in the right direction, but it'll take a very long time at this rate. Culture Ministry, same way, and Ministry of Science and Technology is following mostly Western scientific models. So I don't have I've been told I'm running out of time, so I will close. This is a very huge topic on the Indian knowledge systems, what contributions they have made, the contributions that are currently being made, and the future potential for our knowledge systems. But it all starts with us having respect in our own knowledge rather than expecting somebody else is going to do it for us. You can't set up chairs and ask somebody else going to do that for you. That's not going to happen. We got to own the responsibility. We have to jump into it and take responsibility and produce some results. Thank you very much. To help me, you can do two things. You can go to the subscribe button on my YouTube and subscribe. We need more subscribers there. Secondly, I get lots of emails on people saying, how do we donate? How can we help you? You go to rajivmalhotra.com or you go to infinityfoundation.com and you can hit the donate button. You can donate in dollars. There are different ways mentioned. If you want to donate in rupees, there is a column called Infinity Foundation India, and you click that and there are instructions on how you can donate in India.